If you have your Bible and want to read along for a few verses, I'll be in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 this morning. I'll say from the outset that the older I get, the more I find myself falling into becoming like my dad in some ways. Very analytically minded and potentially at times overthinking things. You can ask my brothers, or you could have asked my mom about that one. Part of that involves an interest in words that, for whatever reason, over the last few years, I've begun to develop. And more so than any are a lot of the words that we tend to use when we come together, whenever we read our English translations of the Bible, that, to put it in a simple phrase, have become somewhat religiousized. We get so used to hearing them in a sterile scriptural context that we don't really step back to think about what the word actually means. And as I was trying to think of what to speak on this morning before the Lord's Supper, I was reading through 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, and there was a particular phrase and word that caught my eye. Beginning in verse 18 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign and Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. We preach Christ crucified. That phrase had never really stood out to me as much as it did in the context of trying to prepare some thoughts to speak on this morning. The question I'd like to ask you is, what is a Christ doing being crucified? The word Christ comes from the Greek word Christos, a translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, the anointed one of God. What is God's anointed doing on a cross? The pursuit of some kind of answer to that question led me to two answers. One, in the context of its potential meaning for us, and one, a potential attempt at a possible answer of what it may be meant for God. And if you would humor me, I'd like to read the words of someone that I think is a little bit more eloquent than myself to answer the first. And it comes along as this. A New Testament text that most Christians pass over without noticing how deeply peculiar it is. Romans chapter 1, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, for the Jew first and then the Greek. It would be hard to imagine someone like Buddha or Muhammad or Confucius implying that his doctrine is something that might appear shameful to people. But this is precisely what the Apostle Paul insinuates about what he calls his gospel, or good news. Why would anyone think that good news might be a matter of shame? Well, because this good news centers around someone who had been put to death on a Roman cross. And it would be difficult to imagine anything in the ancient Mediterranean world that was more horrific than dying in such a manner. The problem, of course, is that we are the inheritors of centuries of artwork and piety that present the cross as a moving or even religious symbol. Some wear it as jewelry. Some hang it on the walls of their homes as a harmless decoration. But for the men and the women of Jesus' time, death by crucifixion was not only painful, It was brutally dehumanizing, humiliating, and shaming. A person condemned to this manner of execution would be stripped naked. The loincloths on most depictions of the crucified Jesus are not historically accurate of what was typical. They would be nailed or tied to a crossbar, fitted into a stake, and then left for hours, or in many cases days, to suffer the excruciating, ex cruce, literally from the cross. The very word excruciating to describe the most immense pain we can imagine was derived from a Roman word that had to be made up to describe what is felt on the cross. The excruciating pain of very slowly asphyxiating while rocking up and down on wounded hands and feet in order to respirate. The mocking of the crucified, which is frankly described in the Gospels, was part and parcel of the execution. The pathetic figure pinioned to his instrument of torture and exposed in the most brutal and demeaning manner. He was meant to be insulted. When at long last the tortured criminal died, his body was allowed to remain on the cross for days, permitting animals to pick over his remains. Jesus' rapid burial was exceptional, a favor specially offered to Joseph of Arimathea, a high-ranking Jewish official. We can clearly see why Cicero referred to crucifixion as, quote, the unsurpassable punishment. To be sure, the gospel proclaimed by the first Christians involves the glorious resurrection, but those initial evangelists never let their hearers forget that the one who had been raised was none other than the one who had been crucified. Paul goes so far as to tell the Corinthians who had perhaps given in too much to realized eschatology that, quote, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. So the question was and remains, why would God's salvation of the human race have to include something as horrifying as crucifixion? Why would the Son of God have to endure not only death, but as Paul eloquently specifies, death on a cross? That question brings us to the seriousness of sin. We live in a time when the human predicament is regularly denied, explained away, or ignored. I'm okay and you're okay, we tell one another. And we bask in the culture's reassurance that I am beautiful in every single way. Despite the massive counter-evidence from the moral disasters of the last century, we are still beguiled by the myth of progress. With just enough technical advancement, psychological insight, and personal liberation, we will solve our problems. On such a reading of the human condition, all we need is a good teacher, a guru with brilliant spiritual insights, or a stirring moral exemplar to stir us to self-actualization. And if things go wrong, a casual word of forgiveness should set them right. But this sort of stupidity and superficiality, the Bible has no truck. The scriptural authors understand sin not so much as a series of acts, but as a condition in which we are stuck. Something akin to an addiction or a contagious disease for which we have no cure. No amount of merely human effort could possibly solve the problem. Rather, some power has to come from outside of us in order to clean up the mess that is us. Something awful has to be done on our behalf in order to offset the awfulness of sin. With this biblical realism in mind, we can begin to comprehend why the crucifixion of the Son of God was necessary. The just rapport between God and human beings could not be reestablished either through our moral effort or with simply a word of forgiveness. Something had to be done, and God alone could do it. That, for me, answers the first part of what the intersection of the cross tends to mean, what it means for us. that he took on the something that had to be done for us. But what it meant for him, I don't know if we have words. I don't know that we could comprehend. Is it like what a mother sees when she holds her newborn child? That love and that desire for that connection? Is it the pain of a parent of a teenager screaming out, "I hate you," paralleled with that love to feel that rejection and love at the same time? I don't know that we could ever comprehend what it's like to love billions of beings enough that you would deny yourself to take on what is justly theirs, the pain and the suffering, the separation, the leaving of your care, to reestablish that relationship. But I think in Jesus' final cry on the cross, we begin to get an insight into at least what that experience was like for him in the moment that was required for the reestablishment of a relationship with God. What are the words that shook the ground, that occurred when darkness was over the land, that rent the temple veil in two? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Scholars and theologians have debated meanings for centuries as to what that particularly comes from. And I am not so wise or arrogant as to stand up here before you today and say I have the answer for that. But I think if we want an insight into what that experience was like for Jesus, perhaps his final words, being the introductory statement to Psalm 22, sheds particular insight into what that moment was like for him. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and am not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. But you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while on my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it has melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me, the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far from me. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. As we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, remember not just what his death, the breaking of his body that we'll remember with this bread. Remember not just his blood that was shed, that it might cleanse us white as snow, that we might re-engage into a relationship anew with God Almighty, the creator of the universe. Remember what he experienced, the excruciating pain upon a cross that the anointed one of God took on himself for you and for me, that we might have this opportunity. Remember him this morning as we partake.